Imagine waking up one morning to the shocking headline, "Germany has entered the war in Ukraine against Russia." For decades, Germany has been seen as the economic engine of Europe, a country focused on trade, diplomacy, and stability. But what if, faced with growing threats, Berlin decided to take a different path? One that would place its soldiers, tanks, and fighter jets directly in the line of fire. This is not just a question of military might. It is a question of history, of fear, of responsibility, and of survival. Germany, a nation haunted by its past, has spent the post-World War II era trying to avoid becoming a central player in armed conflicts. Yet today, with war raging on Europe's eastern border, the pressure is rising. In this video, we explore a chilling scenario. What if Germany, with all its resources and industrial power, joined Ukraine in its fight against Russia? Could it tip the balance of the battlefield? Would it bring the conflict to a swift end? Or would it unleash forces that no one can control, dragging NATO into open war with Moscow, and perhaps pushing the world closer to nuclear confrontation than at any time since the Cold War? To answer these questions, we will look at Germany's military strength, the mindset of its leaders and its people, the possible strategies of intervention, and the dangerous ways Russia could respond. Step by step, we will build a picture of what such a dramatic decision would mean for Europe, for NATO, and for the world. Germany's view of Russia as a threat. To understand why Germany might ever consider joining the war in Ukraine, we need to look at how the nation perceives Russia today. For decades, Berlin tried to maintain a cautious relationship with Moscow, trading energy, keeping channels of diplomacy open, and believing that economic ties would bring stability. But after the invasion of Ukraine, this belief collapsed. Suddenly, Russia was no longer just a difficult neighbor. It was seen as a direct and existential threat to European security. German intelligence agencies now warn that Russia could rebuild its strength and prepare for a wider conflict against NATO before the end of this decade. The German Defense Minister, Boris Pistorius, has stated openly that Russia will not stop with Ukraine, and that within 5 to 8 years, Moscow may be ready to challenge NATO itself. For a government that has long avoided strong military language, this is a dramatic change. The concern is not only political, it is also social. Polls show that many Germans, while reluctant to support a direct war, are increasingly worried about the possibility of Russian aggression spreading westward. These fears have pushed Berlin to consider measures not seen since the Cold War. Refurbishing bomb shelters, developing emergency plans for civilians, and rethinking military service to ensure the Bundeswehr can expand if needed. This shift in mindset reveals something crucial. For Germany, Russia is no longer a distant problem. It is a looming danger that could one day reach its own borders. And that fear, more than anything else, is what could push Berlin toward decisions that once seemed unthinkable. Germany's military power today. If Germany ever chose to join the war directly, its military strength would matter more than anything. So what does the Bundeswehr, Germany's armed forces, actually look like today? On paper, Germany maintains around 180,000 active soldiers and about 30,000 reservists. After years of decline, the army is not the massive force it once was during the Cold War. But what it lacks in size, it makes up for with technology and resources. Germany's armored corps is built around the Leopard 2 main battle tank, a vehicle widely regarded as one of the best in the world. Its advanced fire control systems, strong armor, and reliability make it a powerful tool on the battlefield. Alongside the Leopards, Germany fields infantry fighting vehicles like the Puma and the Marder, and modern artillery systems such as the Panzerhaubitze 2000, capable of striking targets with remarkable precision at long range. In the air, the Luftwaffe operates Eurofighter Typhoon jets, versatile aircraft that can perform both defensive and offensive missions. Germany also continues to use Tornado jets, aging but still important for certain roles, while preparing to introduce the American F-35 stealth fighter later this decade. These future aircraft will give Berlin the ability to carry out advanced missions, including nuclear sharing within NATO. The Navy may be smaller than those of other major powers, but it is highly sophisticated. Germany's Type 212A submarines use air-independent propulsion, making them extremely quiet and difficult to detect, a significant advantage in the Baltic and North Seas. And perhaps Germany's greatest strength lies not in the size of its forces, but in its industrial base. Companies like Rheinmetall and Krauss-Maffei-Wegmann can produce ammunition, vehicles, and air defense systems at scale, providing the kind of long-term supply chain that Ukraine desperately needs. This combination of modern weapons, advanced industry, and NATO integration means that Germany, if it commits, could transform the balance of power on the battlefield. Scenarios of intervention. If Germany were to step into the war, how exactly could it happen? Not all scenarios are the same, and each one carries a different level of risk and consequence. The first and most realistic option is indirect intervention. In this case, Berlin would dramatically scale up what it is already doing, sending weapons, ammunition, and advanced air defense systems to Ukraine. But instead of cautious deliveries, the flow would become overwhelming. Factories across Germany could shift into war production, supplying Ukraine with a constant stream of tanks, artillery shells, and missiles. German trainers could also work on NATO territory, preparing Ukrainian troops to operate the latest equipment. The second option is limited deployment. This would mean German soldiers moving into NATO's eastern flank, Poland, Lithuania, or Romania, not to fight directly, but to secure those borders. By taking over defensive duties there, they would allow other NATO allies, such as the United States or Poland, to concentrate more forces inside Ukraine itself. In practice, this would bring Germany one step closer to the battlefield, even if its troops were not firing directly at Russian forces. The third and most dramatic option is direct combat intervention. Here, German tanks, jets, and soldiers would enter Ukraine alongside Ukrainian forces. German Patriot batteries could shield Kiev and other major cities from missile attacks, while Leopard tanks joined offensives on the ground. This would instantly transform the war, but also carry the highest risk of direct confrontation with Russia. Each scenario represents a sliding scale, from support in the background to presence at the frontier to full-scale combat, and the choice Berlin makes would define whether the war remains contained or escalates into something much larger. Immediate battlefield impact. So what would actually change on the battlefield if Germany stepped in? The answer depends on the level of involvement, but even in a limited form, the impact would be dramatic. The most immediate effect would be in the skies. German Patriot and Iris-T air defense systems could create a protective shield over Ukraine's western regions, intercepting Russian missiles and drones before they reached major cities or supply lines. This alone could save countless lives and give Ukraine breathing space to rebuild its defenses. On the ground, German Leopard 2 tanks would bring firepower and survivability far beyond most of Ukraine's current fleet. These tanks are built for high-intensity combat, capable of engaging Russian armor at long range and with precision. Combined with advanced artillery such as the Panzerhaubitze 2000, German forces could support Ukrainian offensives that break through entrenched Russian positions. But perhaps just as important is logistics. Germany's powerful rail network and industrial base could ensure a steady pipeline of ammunition, spare parts, and replacement vehicles. Wars are not only won by battles, but by the ability to sustain them. And Germany's industry could help Ukraine fight not just today, but tomorrow and the next month as well. In addition, German participation would boost morale. For Ukraine, it would mean that one of Europe's giants is fully committed to its defense. For Russia, it would be a signal that the war is no longer a fight against just Kiev, but against a much larger coalition. In short, Germany's entry would not just add soldiers and machines. It would shift the entire balance of power, changing how both sides fight and how long they can endure. Russia's countermoves. Of course, Russia would not remain passive if Germany entered the war. Moscow has many tools at its disposal, and it would almost certainly use them to send a message of strength and deterrence. The first response would likely come in the digital realm. Russia has long relied on cyber warfare as a way to disrupt its adversaries. Germany's energy grid, financial networks, and transportation systems could all become targets of coordinated cyber attacks. A single blackout in Berlin or Hamburg would be enough to remind the public that war is not confined to the battlefield. Another likely avenue is sabotage and covert action. Russia has networks across Europe that could attempt to damage railways, supply depots, or even ports moving German equipment toward Ukraine. These actions might not be openly claimed by Moscow, but the fingerprints would be clear enough. On the front lines, Russia could try to overwhelm German defenses with massive barrages of missiles and drones, testing the limits of Patriot and IRIS-T systems. Even if Germany's technology performed well, the cost of firing interceptors against cheap drones would create a long-term strain on resources. And then comes the most dangerous possibility: direct strikes against German troops. If Berlin deployed forces inside Ukraine, Russian commanders might calculate that targeting them would pressure Germany to retreat. But this would also risk crossing NATO's red lines, potentially invoking Article 5 and escalating the conflict into a full alliance war. Each countermove by Moscow would carry risks of its own. But one thing is certain: the Kremlin would treat German involvement as a turning point, and it would escalate accordingly, not just militarily, but politically, economically, and psychologically as well. The nuclear shadow. Beneath every move in this war lies a darker possibility: nuclear escalation. If Germany were to join the conflict directly, this risk would rise dramatically. Russia's military doctrine has already lowered the threshold for nuclear use. According to the Kremlin, tactical nuclear weapons could be employed not only if Russia's existence were threatened, but also if a conventional war placed the country at risk of a decisive defeat. The entry of Germany, Europe's largest economy and one of NATO's strongest militaries, could easily be framed by Moscow as just such a threat. The most likely scenario would not begin with strikes on Berlin or other NATO capitals. Instead, Russia could choose a so-called demonstration strike. This might mean detonating a tactical nuclear device over an uninhabited area, or using one against a Ukrainian military target, with the goal of shocking Germany and its allies into backing down. The message would be brutal but clear: Russia is willing to cross the nuclear line if it feels cornered. From there, escalation becomes dangerously unpredictable. Would NATO respond with its own nuclear forces? Would Germany, which participates in NATO's nuclear sharing program, find itself directly involved in planning retaliatory strikes? Or would Western leaders hesitate, fearing that any answer might trigger an uncontrollable chain reaction? The terrifying truth is that once the nuclear threshold is crossed, no one can guarantee how events will unfold. Germany's involvement could therefore transform a brutal regional war into a crisis with global consequences, where every move carries the risk of spiraling into catastrophe. In this sense, the nuclear shadow is not just a background fear. It is the ultimate weapon in Russia's playbook, and the ultimate danger of Germany stepping onto the battlefield. Global consequences and conclusion. If Germany entered the war, the consequences would not stop at Europe's borders. The ripple effects would be felt across the entire world. Economically, markets would shudder. Energy prices could skyrocket as pipelines, shipping routes, and critical infrastructure came under threat. Germany itself, heavily dependent on industry and exports, would see its economy shaken, and with it, the stability of the European Union. Food prices, already strained by the war, could rise further. pushing vulnerable countries into crisis. Politically, the world would be forced to take sides. Nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America that tried to remain neutral might no longer have that option. The conflict would become a test of alliances, reshaping the balance of power far beyond Europe. And socially, the psychological impact would be enormous. For the German people, who have lived for decades in peace, the reality of war would hit home in a way unseen since the mid-20th century. For Russians, it would reinforce the idea that they are locked in a civilizational struggle against the West. For everyone else, it would be a stark reminder of how quickly the global order can unravel. In the end, the question is not simply what Germany could do, but what its choices would unleash. Entering the war might provide Ukraine with a decisive advantage, but it might also trigger an escalation with consequences far beyond anyone's control. So we are left with a haunting dilemma. If Germany joins the war, does it become the savior of Ukraine? Or the spark of something far more dangerous, a conflict that could engulf the world? That is the razor's edge on which Europe now stands, between solidarity and survival, between resolve and catastrophe. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss any updates from the world of military news.